Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us for this York Festival of Ideas event on the history and future of tattoos. My name is Michael White from the History of Art Department at the University of York, and I'm really delighted to be joining us on this very warm evening. But trust me, our speaker is speaking from somewhere even warmer than York, could you believe it, tonight. Just a few technical notes before we start. If you're watching live, you can ask questions using the Q&A button on your screen. You'll find that in the bottom menu. This will be available throughout the event, so questions can be asked at any time. So also put in there any issues you'd like for clarification, or if you're having any technical problems, if you can't hear, or so forth. If you had technical issues such as loss of Wi-Fi, you can rejoin the event using the original link. Please also remember that today's event is being recorded, so you'll be able to watch it again. There are also subtitles available for this event. To turn them off and on, use the CC Live transcript button at the bottom of your screen. Right, so to introduce our speaker, very delighted to introduce you to Allison Hawn. She holds a BA in psychology from Northwestern Nazarene University and an MA in communication with a focus on advocacy from Arizona State University, and she'll be receiving her PhD in communication later this year. Allison's dissertation examines the communicative practices of tattoo artists, as well as the history of colonialism in Western tattooing practices and the ways that tattoo artists democratise the world of fine art. So tonight, she joins us to share her research that spans the ages, so from Ötzi the Iceman to Norman Sailor Jerry Collins to modern tattoo shops. We're going to hear about tattoo artistry's colourful past and discover its bold future. So Allison, a very warm welcome, and over to you.
Thank you, Michael. Just a quick update. I actually have received my PhD at this point, and that dissertation that he was just speaking about is available. If you would like a copy, please feel free to reach out to me. You can probably find my contact information, but if you would like a copy of that dissertation, I would be happy to present it. So first of all, hello and Cúd Míle Fáilte for any of my family in Scotland who are currently here. I'm very excited to talk about this. This is one of those areas that I have a lot of love for. I have spent the last 4 years doing ethnography with tattoo artists in shops, talking to tattoo artists, working alongside them. I've worked in a couple of tattoo shops. And one of the main focuses that my work has done is to kind of trace how we got from ancient work of tattooing to where it's at today and how that history really affects it. So I'm going to be doing a 40-minute presentation on several thousand years plus the future. So my apologies if I gloss over something. Again, my dissertation is available. It is 307 pages of basically this. So if you ever want to know more, I also have a lot of book recommendations that I can give you. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and let's get us started. So one of the things that oftentimes happens when people find out that I research with tattoo artists and that I do tattoo history is they ask a certain set of questions. So I'm just gonna get those out of the way first. The first question people always ask me is, how many tattoos do you have? And the answer is a lot. Guys, I stopped counting after 20, and if I try to count again, it looks like I'm doing some weird version of the Macarena. So I gave up after 20. I've done about 80 hours in a tattoo chair myself. I'm starting to run out of real estate. The next question people tend to ask is, why do you study with tattoo artists? And the answer to that really comes from a moment that I had when I was looking into tattoo art, where I realized there was a gap in current research. There is a ton of research out there that you can find on why people get tattoos, their motivations for getting tattoos. And there's a lot of research out there for perceptions of tattoos, so stigma in the workplace, or older generations looking at younger generations, or younger generations and their perceptions of art. However, there is almost no academic research on tattoo artists themselves. There are a couple of medical journals that mention tattoo artist back pain, but that was pretty much it. So I found it interesting that we have this kind of edge pieces of a puzzle, but we're missing the actual image in the center, because you can't get perceptions of tattoos and you can't understand why people get tattoos without the tattoo artist who was actually creating those tattoos. So that's really where this work began. The first thing I really want to discuss is that tattoo artists really exist as residual communities, and this will become important when we talk about the history. So modern tattoo artists have their own culture. Now, Williams in 1980 discussed the idea of a residual community as one that exists kind of outside a normal society, but at the same time is dependent on that society for its continued survival. So an excellent example of this is the Amish. The Amish have their own rules, they have their own religious beliefs, they have their own culture. They really don't ascribe to a lot of society's rules. However, they still sell things to people outside their community. They still have restaurants where they bring in money, and that money helps keep their way of life alive. Tattoo artists oftentimes exist in that same kind of space. I have looked a little bit into UK laws, if you can't tell by my accent. I am from America, and I found it interesting, particularly the laws that you can find around tattoo art. Now, I know that in the UK, it kind of varies from place to place, and that you guys do have more rules than we do in the United States. But a good example of why tattoo artists are a residual community is honestly looking at the lack of laws. So Beasley in 2012 actually did a law review over the laws in America that cover tattoo art. There's one federal law in America. That's it. That there's one law governing tattoo artists, and that is you have to be the age of 18 or have parental consent to get a tattoo. Most states, that is the only law in the books as well. In fact, over half of the United States, that is the only rule. Very rarely will you find a state that has anything about bloodborne pathogen, training, and any of that, which is interesting. So in Arizona, where I'm from, the only rule is the 18-year-old rule. But we have 16 pages on hairdressers, 16 pages of laws addressing who can be a hairdresser, what kind of training do you have to have, how long have you trained as a hairdresser? And so the person who can do this to you, and admittedly, this is bad, like it's bad, but it will grow back. You know, the difference between a good haircut and a bad haircut is really just 3 weeks. They have more regulations than somebody who could possibly do this. I'm still trying to figure out what is surrounding the tiger. I know it's supposed to be a flower, but to me, it looks like fruit leather. So it's interesting to me that tattoo art and tattoo artistry has oftentimes been relegated to this side area where we know it's there, but we really don't deal with it, and we don't really look at it that much. And a lot of that has to do with the history of tattoos. Now, I'm going to fully admit that most of my expertise on tattoo art is in the history of Western tattooing, but I also do have quite a bit of knowledge about the history of tattooing throughout the world. So what I'm mostly talking about when I talk about the future of tattoos is going to relate, it will be globally relevant. However, it also directly relates to Western art and Western tattooing practices as well. So I have a quick question, and I want you guys to think about this. Where do tattoos come from? Who started tattoos? Who created the first tattoo? I want you guys to think about countries, continents. What you may find interesting is that the first tattoos that we know of actually kind of sprung up globally. We have Ötzi the Iceman from the Italian Alps. He was discovered 30 years ago, a couple of months ago, and he has tattoos that have survived for over 5,300 years. But then we also have Egyptian mummies that have been discovered that have tattoos lasting over 4,000 years. Then, of course, there's the Picts of northern Scotland, who were recorded as having tattoos around 2,500 years ago. Native American tribes, we recently in New Mexico and Arizona discovered 2,000-year-old tattoo needles that were cactus spine bound with yucca leaves that were used as implements to tattoo. And there's lots of different Native American and First Nation in Canada tribes that had tattooing practices. The Maori, at least for 1,000 years, have had tattooing practices, although a lot of scholars say it's more likely to be around 4,000 to even 5,000 years ago. The Aztecs had tattooing practices 700 years ago. So it's also important to look at the differences in these tattooing practices. No one of these was done the exact same way. They believe that Ötzi the Iceman's tattoos were done with bone and ash and a variety of herbs. The Picts used woading, which came from a specific type of flower. Native American tribes, like I said, the ones in the Southwest were using cactus vine and yucca leaves. So these are not things that were necessarily being taught as people changed or immigrated to other places. Instead, these were things that these cultures were developing. So no one culture can really definitively say, we started tattoos. So oftentimes when I ask this question of people, though, I get an answer that says, oh, it originated somewhere in Japan. It originated somewhere in Africa, maybe the Middle East. So it's interesting to think about the fact that it actually generated a lot of different places. So here's where we're going to step into an area of colonialism. And I know I'm speaking mostly to a UK audience. I'm going to be talking about American colonialism too, because we definitely did that. So this is not a blame game. It's interesting to me that we do have tattooing in our history. We have people like the Picts. We have the Grecians that oftentimes got tattooed like their Thracian neighbors did. We have crusaders who went to the Middle East and came back with tattoos. So these all had their own words. They had their own terminology for these things. So why are we using the word tattoo? The word tattoo actually originated in the Polynesian Islands. It comes from a blend between a Marquesan and a Samoan term, which is tatau and tattoo, to become what we modern day call a tattoo. But why? We had our own name for these things. In reality, it's because we had started to figure out ways to distance ourselves from those that we were colonizing. Sailors ended up basically combining these two as they ran into cultures that had tattoos and learned what they were called. So Groot in 2015, and by the way, best scholar name ever, came up with this idea of the savage craft. And I would highly suggest looking at her article. It is very well done. But essentially what happened is, particularly in the age of colonialism, as explorers were going out and finding all of these different countries, they started to figure out ways to draw the line between who was human, who was civilized, and who was an other, who was an outsider, who was lesser. And one of the ways that was accomplished was by labeling tattooed natives as other. There's this fantastic printing of essentially a advertisement where somebody had kidnapped two native persons from Canada in the late 1500s, brought them back and was putting them on tour. And in that pamphlet, in that advertisement, they basically said, come and gaze upon these people so that you know how we are separated from the savage, how we are separated from the people who do not know God. So literally, we were using tattooing as one of those signs that we are better than someone else, or we know better. And so therefore, when we take over a place, when we invade a place, when we, take over resources, it's not even necessarily just us taking something over. Instead, we're really helping because we're going to help civilize these people. This was a point made by the way, by Sartre in Colonialism and Neo-Colonialism in his essays that came out in the 1950s. And so oftentimes what happened is art that was considered indigenous, art that was considered done by people who were not white European or American colonizers, was oftentimes deemed as a lesser thing. It was called craft. It was called a savage craft. Interestingly enough, this also happened with a lot of art that women did. We oftentimes think of things like crochet or tapestry or any of those others as primarily being performed by women. And those have also been oftentimes relegated to craft. I personally cross stitch. People consider that a craft. They do not consider it an art. So it's interesting to think about the ways that we have divided art based on these colonialist notions and what we do consider or do not consider art. And this is going to become important as we talk about tattooing and its future. So what started to happen in this period in history is tattooed individuals were oftentimes pulled from the islands that they came from, the countries that they came from, as colonizers found them. And they were oftentimes put on display, kind of like a sideshow thing, where people would charge money so that people could come in and view these tattooed individuals. On the left hand of the screen, you'll see here a Prince Gioli or Prince Giolo, depending on which pamphlet you were looking at, who was basically brought over and put on tour. Now, he's one of the most famous, both because his pamphlets have really survived. This drawing by Andrew Layton is probably the most famous of those, but also because he survived as one of the longest captives. Unfortunately, a lot of the people brought across the ocean or back into these societies to be put on show either died of malnutrition or disease fairly early on. He survived a whopping 2 years. And during that time, he gained a lot of popularity as a sideshow attraction. So we're going to kind of move into a history here of talking about kind of tattoos as entertainment, because this is heavily entrenched in the ways that we as a Western society have viewed tattoos. Eventually, what started happening is it became really expensive to capture people and try to keep them alive, for them to only die a few months later because they were being treated horribly and not as human beings. And so a new plan was kind of brought forth. There were certain individuals who realized that they could pass as being an exotic other. They could pass as being not white. And in doing so, they would actually go and get themselves tattooed and put themselves on display. And so you see one of the greatest examples of this is Captain Constantinus. I'm sorry, I always mess up his name, who was actually from the UK. But he covered himself in a whole bunch of animal tattoos, a whole bunch of flower tattoos, and he would basically claim that he was from whatever country or whatever civilization he thought he could get the most press out of. So in one town, he would be a Buddhist holy man. In another town, he would be a rescued prince from Turkey. And he would basically use these stories. And he's definitely not the only one who did this. There were quite a few tattooed performers who took this on. So now we've gone from capturing people and putting them on display to instead kind of appropriating another identity / pretending that the tattoos are part of that identity. But regardless of which one it is still creating that image of the other. It is still creating well, that person is not like us. And so we start to see this separation in history between tattooing being part of our cultures, which it was, to becoming this stigmatized thing. So that story ended up getting kind of adapted over time. People who could not pass as exotic others oftentimes wanted to get in on the sideshow business as far as being tattooed. And to be clear, tattooed performers could actually make a decent amount of money. So one of the main things that they would start to do is that a lot of these performers would claim that they were kidnapped by savages, and then they were forcibly tattooed in what they literally called tattoo torture, which, okay. I mean, if you've ever had your anything close to the bone tattooed, maybe you can consider that torture, but it's also not a practice that has been really documented in just about anywhere. One of the reasons that this trend really caught on was because of Olive Oatman. You'll see Olive Oatman on the far left. She was born in 1837 to a group of Mormon missionaries, and her family was killed by Native Americans who were responding to an attack on their own village. She was kidnapped along with her sister. Her sister unfortunately died of an unknown disease soon after. She was a very small child, about 3 or 4 at the time. And she was actually passed off to another tribe, the Mojave, who basically took her in and raised her as their own child. In fact, she was considered a replacement for a child that had been killed by settlers. You'll see that she has tattoos on her face. Those were the tattoos that the Mojave had at that time and were very important to her culture. Eventually, the tribe managed to pass by some frontier kind of law group. I'm forgetting the word for this at the moment, but they essentially recognized that she was not like them and kidnapped her and took her back into American society. Now, here's the problem with this. She didn't speak English. She had been raised by two basically loving parents in a completely different culture. And her brother, who was still alive and had been searching for her, immediately realized that there was a money-making opportunity to be had. So he had her tattoos darkened a bit and then basically took her on tour. And she spent a good amount of her life as an attraction. And the story that he told was not one that she had been cared for, but instead that she had been kidnapped. And this is why we need manifest destiny and we need to push forward into the West. Even though that wasn't the case. Olive Oatman became extremely famous both here and in the UK as well. So you started seeing these other tattoo artists or other tattoo performers start to adopt these narratives. The woman that you see in the center is named Nora Hildebrandt. She was a common law wife to Martin Hildebrandt that you'll see on the far right-hand side, who was one of the first white tattoo artists in America. I'm saying first white one because there was lots of indigenous artists far before him. And Nora actually adopted that exact same dialogue. She was tattooed by her husband, but she basically claimed that she had been kidnapped by Sitting Bull and tattooed forcibly as a ceremonial revenge. The story got muddled over the years. She told multiple stories. What's fascinating about this story is that most of her tattoos were actually of things like the American flag, the eagle, which is our national bird. She had a line from the Constitution on her back. So very convincing indigenous tattoos. However, what soon became clear was that she didn't even need the story. She didn't need the story at all. And this is what happened. This is where we start to see a change in tattooed performers and the stories they started telling. They started realizing that they didn't have to have a story. They didn't have to have some weird, very appropriative and very ugly backstory. Instead, they could just tattoo themselves and people would be interested in them because it wasn't common. It wasn't something that they had seen. It had been suppressed in their own societies for so long that seeing a person like them tattooed was novel. Maud Wagner, who's on the far left, is actually one of these performers, and she was one of the first white female tattoo artists in America. You'll see Omi in the center there being tattooed by the famous UK tattoo artist George Burchett. By the way, Omi's name is a pun because people used to say "oh my" a lot when they saw him, so he became the Great Omi. And on the far right side, you'll see Artoria, who was another performer who actually was extremely well paid. She retired fairly young, I would say like in her mid 30s to early 40s, and was able to live off the proceeds of her work the rest of her life. So now we have tattooed individuals who are basically able to make a living without necessarily appropriating other types of stories or cultures. And this is extremely interesting because it was also a way that women had an opportunity to make money in a society that oftentimes would not allow them to get jobs. Women who were tattooed performers oftentimes made at least 4 to 6 times more per week than the average woman at the time. Looking at American statistics, looking at American money, at the time that Artoria was performing, which was early 1900s, she was making 3 times that of a male steel worker who was working 80 hours a week, and she was only working roughly 16 hours a week. So the fascination with tattoos became something that women could embrace and others could embrace to become more economically free. Now, throughout its history, tattooing has faced a lot of fluxes where it's basically like, yes, this is acceptable, it's fashionable, and then it's gone back to being gutter trash. One of the best examples of this was during the Victorian period. During the Victorian period, tattoo tourism actually became a thing. The wealthy really wanted to prove their wealth, and so they didn't have an iPhone, they didn't have the brand new car. Instead, what they had was their ability to travel to what they considered exotic locations. And during this Victorian period, a lot of people would go to these other countries, get tattooed as proof that they had been able to go to that country, and basically bring it back as a permanent postcard. The man you see on the left here is Prince Valdemar of Denmark. He was actually tattooed in multiple locations. There were multiple British royals who oftentimes actually had tattoos. And so it survived for a period of about 50 years. I have a great question here. Where did the first sideshow performers get their tattoos done? Oftentimes they were done by American tattoo artists. Oftentimes they were very underground individuals. So tattoo artistry did exist, but oftentimes it wasn't considered. Thank you for the question, Liz. So what happened to take this Victorian period of tattoos as status symbols, of signs of your travels, to trash? Well, in 1891, the first electric tattooing machine was patented by Samuel O'Reilly. And this tattoo machine revolutionized the art because it made tattoos faster, cheaper, and also more intricate in ability to design certain things. More people could learn how to tattoo quickly and make money doing it. So the second that it became more available to the populace, to the common person, it fell out of fashion immediately because now it was commonplace. It was, oh, that's something that the lower classes do. How dare we? So it's interesting to think about not only the colonialism that has brought these attitudes towards tattooing, but also oftentimes the classist notions that come in with our perceptions of tattooing. And the reason we bring up both of these things is because these are oftentimes present in the perceptions that we have still of tattoo artists and of tattooed individuals. These notions haven't gone away. We still live our societal history. My background is mostly in communication. So when we stigmatize something, it's oftentimes done by society communicating with itself and basically making the decision through joint communication, through shared history of what is acceptable and what is not. Irving Goffman's book, by the way, Stigma, does a great job of outlining all of this, written back in 1963. Highly recommend that as a read. So the second that tattoos became more common, they fell out of fashion. However, what we started to see was that tattoos started a new life in other areas. Now, military personnel had been getting tattoos, particularly sailors had been getting tattoos for ages. But with the incoming World War I and even into World War II, so many soldiers, both in the United States and in the UK, and actually just in Europe in general, were afraid that their bodies would be unrecognizable if they were killed in battle. So you started seeing a lot of these military tattoos being used to help identify a person, or getting these things as a form of belonging to whatever branch of military they were in. It showed that you were really committed to whatever group you were in. At this exact same time, a lot of people who were immigrants, particularly immigrants to America, found tattooing as a way to help keep their own cultures alive. So you have, on the right-hand side here is an Italian immigrant who basically became tattooed when he came to America to help remind him of the heritage that he was leaving behind. So it became a permanent reminder. So tattoos started to take on different meanings, and not just some of the assumed meanings that a lot of people had about them. I don't know how many of you guys have heard that, tattoos mean someone has gone to prison. That is a notion from a very, very long time ago that actually originated back in Roman times. So this idea of being able to change perceptions and change understandings for why people get tattoos is vitally important. So now we're going to skip ahead a little bit to where we are today with tattoos. Tattoos have reached a certain level of recognition. They have reached a certain level of acceptability in today's society. Although, again, that has fluctuated throughout history. The 1950s, tattooing was evil. During the 1970s, not so much. So these fluctuations keep happening. I am going to be talking about the term fine art for a second. And I know a lot of the people watching this are probably art historians to some extent. I am not specifically talking about paintings. I'm not specifically talking about like the actual pieces of art. As a communication person, I really look at how words can really power things, how words can have power. And the term fine art is one that has often been decided and described by those in patriarchal, white, and wealthy stations. The people who decide whether, a Banksy piece is worth a lot of money is not just Banksy and the public who enjoy his art. It's places like Sotheby's. It's art critics. It's the people who basically hold the keys to this. And oftentimes those keys have been held by people who are white, straight, cis, and male. This has honestly created a bit of a divide among the public between what is considered, available art and fine art. And coming from somebody who grew up relatively poor, growing up, I never felt like fine art was something accessible to me. It was not, it was something that was only in museums that you had to have a special understanding of. And recent studies have actually shown that there is a wide amount of the population, at least in America, that feels the same way. Visits to art museums before COVID had actually seen a dramatic decline within the last decade, which means there's something wrong with the perception of art. The art hasn't changed. Those statues haven't changed. The paintings haven't changed. It's people's feeling about whether art is accessible. Via colonialism, a lot of art, a lot of craft, a lot of indigenous work has been relegated to that of, again, the savage craft, as Groot discussed, instead of being seen as art. And when something that your culture creates is relegated that way, when it's discarded that way, oftentimes it creates this idea again that art is not for me. What I'm doing is not art. And so we face this issue in society in which people oftentimes feel distant from fine art, but we also have groups that feel disenfranchised because their art is not being respected as such. And granted, this is a very brief discussion of this. This is a topic that I can talk about for hours. However, there have been some attempts to reclaim ink, and specifically cultural forms of ink, and try to get it instituted as art. And those examples have actually had amazing effects on the public's perception of art. On the left-hand side, we have Wang Od, who is the final hereditary Mambadok tattoo artist in the world. Because she has done a lot of work in advocacy for her art, she has actually brought a lot of attention to this dying art and has gotten a lot of support from the worldwide community. Even more important, in New Zealand, and I'm sorry, I'm going to space on the name of the museum, my apologies. There is a museum in New Zealand that basically opened up a permanent art gallery of Maori art, heavily focusing in on the tattoos, or the tā moko, which is what you oftentimes see on people's faces. These are very sacred, by the way. They literally are people's family names and their names kind of combined into a symbol. What that museum immediately had was not only an influx of visitors who were Maori, who suddenly felt respected because their art was being respected, but a whole bunch of other people who maybe would never have come to an art museum because they felt separated from art, but seeing tattoos there, hey, I have tattoos. That's awesome. I want to check that out. So in conclusion, where I see tattoo artistry in the future is really elevating art as respected art. I'm not going to use the term fine art because I really think that term is a little, we might need to work on that term. Sorry to any art historians in the room. And the reason that we really need to focus in on tattoo artists as creating fine art is It will create art accessibility for a lot of people. It is an excellent gateway into art, into bringing people who normally wouldn't engage with art into it. It would provide more respect for cultural and sacred tattooing practices that have been existent for thousands of years. Those things that have oftentimes been relegated to the side and not as art. It would also bring a realization of the skill mastery involved in tattooing. If you think about it, tattooing is one of the hardest arts to perform. And the reason for that is because the canvas is constantly changing. A human canvas going from one person to the next is not going to be the same. Joe, one of the tattoo artists that I've worked with, basically stated that she could do the same exact tattoo on 100 people and it would always be different because everyone's skin composition, everyone's melanin composition is going to be different. Plus, there's this whole aspect of aging. Tattoo artists have to know how a piece of tattoo art is going to remain fresh looking for the longest period of time. And know where to place those tattoos, know what kind of colors to use to make that work. Furthermore, their canvas is literally alive. Their canvas can get up and move. It can suddenly laugh. It can sneeze. It can suddenly have to go to the bathroom and forget to tell its tattoo artist that it needs to go. And so tattoo artists have to be very, very good at what they do to perfect their art. And many of them are. The tattoo artist community, even though there's not a lot of rules policing it federally, as a residual community, they have a lot of policing techniques that they do employ to help keep the mastery alive. And finally, by considering tattoo art as more respected art, it would bring more respect to tattoo artists who are oftentimes undersold and oftentimes not respected for the artists that they are. So that is really where I see the future of tattoos going, is an embrace by not only the public, but also by the fine art community. And I think that would have a nice symbiotic effect in that we would make fine art more accessible, but then also we can make a lot of the stigma diminish around tattoo art and people who get tattooed. So thank you all for listening. I will go ahead and stop sharing my screen. I'm trying to also pull up the Q&A. Hello, Michael.
Yeah. That was absolutely fantastic. That's such a great talk. And we've got various questions. You might be able to see them as well, been popping in the Q&A. I've got quite a few questions, but I'm going to keep a little bit quiet and let our audience really have the first go. I can see there are a couple of there that are a bit slightly more historical questions, maybe from Steve and the anonymous. Maybe we can sort of take those. So there's one about full color tattooing and fashionability. When did full color tattoos become fashionable? That might be quite a complicated one to answer in terms of becoming available and becoming fashionable. But what would you say to that?
I mean, it's a complicated question, but I can answer it, I think, relatively short. So tattoos have oftentimes been in color. So for instance, pit tattoos were Woden, which is a deep blue. You'll see the same color inside my ear. And so it really depends on the culture. It depends on what area of the earth and what time period you're talking about. Now, the ones that you're talking about, so I don't actually know how to do this on a screen. So things with more intricate designs, with more like shading, is that, I'm guessing that's probably what you mean. That has really come about since the invention of the electric tattooing machine, because inks could be adapted a little differently than some of the traditional stick and poke tattoos. A lot of tattoo artists end up making their own inks. And as that art the art of making the inks itself became its own thing, you started to see a proliferation of different types of tattoos and different colors. So the modern tattoos, things like the American classic tattoo, really came about in that 1900s. Well, across the 18th century, really, or sorry, the 20th century. So that's a very short answer, but I'd be happy to elaborate if you need me to.
Yeah, and I think maybe that we also have one just after that was given in anonymously, so I don't know who this is, but I'll read it out. But so one of the obstacles to getting more tattoos for myself is the cost. I was wondering with the early tattoo performers, in order to pursue the financial opportunities of being a tattooed person, how much they'd be expecting to pay to get sufficiently covered to go into business. Just really interesting.
Maud Wagner actually dated her tattoo artist and eventually married him. Nora Hildebrandt did the same thing, except they never got married. They were just common law spouses. So oftentimes it was running into a tattoo artist that was willing to do it. And tattoos were not as expensive back then because remember, they were heavily stigmatized. So oftentimes a tattoo artist giving a tattoo was kind of, oh, great, you know, so it wasn't as expensive as we would think of it today. By the way, an expensive tattoo is oftentimes a better tattoo. So just throwing that out there. Cheap tattoos tend to not last.
Okay. And then Jenna asked about what's your favorite tattoo on a royal person? Yeah.
Oh, are we talking historically or modern?
Jenna hasn't specified, so either maybe.
At one point during the Victorian period, the Prince of Wales had a tattoo of a dragon up. He went to Japan and had a tattoo of a dragon up and down his arm, which of course it immediately fell out of fashion directly after he'd done that because that was around 1890 when he got that. And so my favorite would be all of the pictures afterwards of him trying to covertly cover it up. So that might be my favorite.
Okay, great. And so Rebecca's asked about, I guess what might be sort of a common perception among the people today, probably in the UK, that sailors had tattoos, and then people sort of copied that. She says, where I'm from, there's a conception that tattoos jumped from sailors to young people. Do you think that was the case, or is it more that the public was just always being tattooed? I'm from a port city, she writes, and that's just lots more questions just came in. That one just flipped off the screen. But yeah, I'm from a port city, so that might be why it's associated so much with sailors and nobody else.
Yeah, so actually going back to that whole Victorian period where tattoos suddenly became fashionable, the two people who could afford to travel or who did travel were the wealthy and the sailors who took them to places. And so oftentimes they were the two groups that got tattooed the most. However, tattooing was still existent in the UK. It was still existent in America. That had never gone away, but it was more underground. So oftentimes we think of sailors, there's that stereotype of like, oh, the tattooed sailor, Popeye the Sailor Man kind of thing. But it was still being practiced in various cultures, in various groups, and in various places still in Europe. It just, like I said, it was just very underground. So honestly, a lot of people were warned against getting tattoos because of the sailors. So I wouldn't say that was as much of the influence. More just the existent things that were also there, and also the group belongings. A lot of tattoos during this time period and time periods before were due to group belonging. My family is Scottish. We come from the north areas of Scotland, and we've been getting the same tattoo for 2,000 years now. We have a traditional tattoo that we get. And so it really depends on the area, the culture, and what was going on.
Yeah, great. I mean, there are loads of sort of questions that sort of come in. They're quite diverse. So just try and pick up a little bit of a thread. There's another one actually. It's about the sort of cost benefit of tattooing, I might say. But so, question is, do you think the common person is being priced out of tattoos as it becomes considered more of a high art form? So if we make it, as you're suggesting, to more respected, and we talk about it in these more artistic terms, do you think that actually might make it less available financially to people? I guess is the thrust of the question there.
So I think there are always going to be people who take advantage of something becoming fancier or more trendy. I've seen this with certain tattoo shops that I've gone to where everything is, done in crystal and there's gold filigree everywhere. And they're doing these very serious minimalist tattoos. But by and large, the tattoo artist community itself is one that's very welcoming. And it is a group of artists. They are artists first. And so what that oftentimes breeds is it allows tattoo artists, or tattoo artists oftentimes want to create unique pieces of art. So I don't believe that the tattoo artist community would be okay with price gouging people because it would limit the number of creative designs they get to do. On the other hand, what it would allow them to do is be a little bit more choosy about which tattoos they accept and which ones they have to do. Because sometimes tattoo artists just have to accept a design to keep the lights on in their shop, which is why you end up with things like tattoo trends where 9 million people have an infinity sign, or the one that's currently happening in America where everyone has dark forest sleeves. I don't know if that's happening in the UK yet or not.
The sleeve, yeah.
Yeah, but it's specifically of like a forest silhouette. Sometimes there's a wolf, you know. So I think the respect wouldn't necessarily lead to that particular problem, but I do think it would allow artists to kind of be a little bit more choosy and be allowed to kind of say, yes, that is my jam, as opposed to, I guess I'll do it.
Okay, well, interesting. So we've got a question here about global tattoo conventions. So KJM, that's what role do you see, if any, for global? That might follow on a bit about trends or distinctiveness. So maybe you can comment on global tattoo conventions.
I laugh because this is literally a rant I went on in front of my students at one point for about an hour.
Okay.
So it's not going to be an hour rant, I promise. So there are two different types of tattoo artist conventions. There are the ones that are put on by the actual tattoo artist community themselves. So tattoo artists organize them, tattoo artists bring everybody together. Oftentimes they're labeled as invitationals. That's usually one of the signs, although that's not 100%. And that means that they've scoped out the artists ahead of time who they're accepting in, that they will allow in. Those ones have a bigger impact as far as the tattoo art world goes, because again, it's the artists themselves making the decisions. This is also where a lot of the residual culture kind of meets and trying to figure out a way, kind of reconfirms their identity. So they'll do things like tattoo award ceremonies where tattoo artists judge other people's works and kind of award them. They'll do recognition for years of work inside the community. They'll do all of those kind of cultural affirmation type things. On the other hand, you have what are oftentimes labeled as expos, which are run by giant companies that don't really have much to do with tattooing. They're usually large events corporations. And what they do is they usually charge, tattoo artists usually have to pay a booth fee even at the invitationals. But what they do is they basically say, if you can pay the fee, you can join. And I've been to those before, and you will get some excellent artists, but you will also get Jim Bob, who bought a tattoo machine off Amazon for $26.99, and now he's a tattoo artist, damn it, and is doing things that look like absolute crap. So I would say check into who is actually running the convention before you go, because the ones that are actually going to have an impact, the ones that the art kind of gets talked about and brought out and new ideas are brought out, is really the ones being run by the tattoo artists. As far as promoting tattoo trends go, Pinterest, Instagram, Facebook, all of the social medias, that has spurred a lot of the tattoo trends that we've seen in modern day trends. The infinity sign, Pinterest. The forest sleeve, Instagram and Pinterest. So really social media is the one shaping a lot of the trends nowadays. Though we did see this happen back in the 90s and early 2000s before the internet proliferated everything. But the trends moved slower then. Now trends will change every like 4 or 5 months. Back then it was like the 90s, you get your weird fake tribal tattoo, like everybody's got that. So, and that trend stuck around for a lot longer. So hopefully that clarifies.
Yeah, so I just noticed, KJM, that you had a more kind of fuller version of this lower down the Q&A, but hopefully Allison's very full answer has captured what you were seeking to find out. So just a very quick one, and again, an anonymous person, whether you'd agree that getting tattoos is an addictive practice?
Personally, for me, yes. Like I said, I've spent around 80 hours and I'm probably going to hit the 100-hour mark by the end of the summer. I'm not going to lie. For some people, it can be. So when you are in this kind of situation where you have kind of a constant, it's kind of like a buzzing sunburn, and it's constant. And oftentimes what people experience while they're being tattooed is kind of a meditative state. So it's not full on like disassociation from the world, but oftentimes there is a level of serotonin that is left, that leaves the brain to kind of tackle the pain issue. So you do get a boost. And some people can become quote unquote addicted to that boost. However, it's not a clinical addiction. There's no clinical basis for tattoo addiction. For me, I find it cathartic, and I find it great to tie back to my roots, and a variety of other things. So it really depends on person to person, but there is no clinical tattoo addiction.
Mm. Yeah, so there's so many great questions on that. I just want to link some of them together. That and to pick up the thing about roots. So James Gaines asked, I'm curious about the tattoos being reminders of the home country and immigrant communities. Was this very widespread, or just in one or two communities? And was there a lasting legacy from this?
So it was, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, it's fine, go on.
Oh, I was just going to say it was fairly widespread. And this also happened with people immigrating around Europe as well. Romani are oftentimes people that get tattoos based on their culture, but we've also seen it with German immigrants in the early 1900s. We saw it with Italian immigrants all the way up until the 1960s, although some of those tattoos are still being done. A lot of people from, there's a couple of African nations in particular where immigrants come from, and they get reminders of the homeland tattooed on them somewhere. So it's not something that has really been specific to one culture, one continent of groups. It is more widespread among groups that have faced a sudden diaspora, where a lot of them have been moved out of their homelands. You see it a lot more in that case, but you do see it across a lot of different cultures, not just moving within, Western society, but also in Eastern societies and all of those.
Yeah, great. We've got there's been such fantastic response in the question. So this one's really a really interesting one about whether you know of any fictional works, either historical or contemporary, that address some of the issues you discussed, such as the colonial aspect. So works of fiction.
I can't think of any fiction off the top of my head. One of the best books to read about this is by is edited and compiled by a lady named Jane Kaplan. It is a collection of essays done by various scholars in a variety of different areas called Written on the Body. And there are several essays in that touch on this topic. And while they're not while they are nonfiction stories and not fictional stories, a lot of them are written really engagingly and are very interesting. Like they kind of have that narrative feel to them. So if you were interested in looking into that, that would be a great one. And then there is also Written on the Body, which is a book specifically about women and the history of tattooing with women. Sorry, did I say Written on the Body? I meant Subversive Bodies. There we go. So there's a couple of different areas you could go, but I don't unfortunately know really of any fiction.
Yeah, I mean, there's a part of my kind of teenage brain that sort of woke up a bit there. I read quite a lot of science fiction as a young person, and there's a Ray Bradbury novel, The Illustrated Man. There's a really interesting.
Yeah.
If you like science fiction,
I forgot about The Illustrated Man.
There's an Alfred Bester novel called The Star's My Destination, which mixes this kind of thing about sailors into kind of outer space, but this guy ends up with a kind of something tattooed on his face in quite an interesting way. So if people are interested in science fiction, there are a couple of things I can think of. But picking up on that question about women and tattooing, so Leah's asked, I really enjoyed the discussion of how women benefited from tattooing. Is there anything more you can say on this? Are there any feminist elements in the history of tattooing?
There are so many feminist elements in the history of tattooing. First of all, a lot of the practitioners of historic tattooing, a lot of them were actually female. There were a lot of cultures where tattoo artists were respected holy persons in their villages, and most oftentimes those were women. That is true in various Polynesian countries. That is true in certain African cultures. That is true among a lot of Native American tribes. So even just the origins of tattooing, the ancient origins, you see a lot of women present. Furthermore, when you start talking more about modern tattooing, it really was a way for women to release themselves from either marriage. They didn't, because you can't support yourself if you're not married in a lot of parts of history, but also from doing low cost, high labor work. So if you weren't married, you were babysitting, you were nannying, you were a maid, you were kind of these things. One of the things interesting about Nora Hildebrand is she had tattoos all the way down to her wrists. She had them up her neck. But the fashion of the time, the Victorian fashion, was to wear things that completely covered all of her tattoos. So she was able to make a ton of money and actually elevate her social status, because she would go out in typical Victorian garb and people wouldn't know she was tattooed. And if they did, because they had seen her perform, they were too embarrassed to admit that they knew, because they'd gone to a sideshow. So she actually elevated her social status just by being a tattooed woman. So there's lots of different examples. And Maud Wagner is really kind of the catalyst tattoo artist for a lot of the designs that we still see today. You hear a lot about Sailor Jerry Collins, but Maud Wagner, without her, Sailor Jerry wouldn't have had a leg to stand on. So there's lots of different areas where women and the idea of feminism in tattooing has really been shown.
Great. So we've just got time for, I think, one or two more questions. So it's great to have so many questions, and thank you and the audience for asking such a great range of questions. There's one from Bethan here, Bethan Jones. Really enjoyed this talk. Thank you. I'm curious if you did work with any more extreme tattoo artists. Here we go. Those who've done eyeball tattooing, for example, and if you see that kind of tattooing becoming viewed as a fine, respectable art.
I'm extreme is kind of a nebulous term. I've done work with tattoo artists who also do electrocautery design. I've done work with tattoo artists who also do tongue splits. There's lots of things that might be considered extreme depending on who you are and what area you're in. But things like eyeball tattooing, I think if it becomes more stable, and by that I mean currently eyeball tattoos have a really short fade out period where a lot of the times the ink kind of gets absorbed into the eye and then it kind of vanishes or it fades out really quickly. I think if tattoo artists can kind of figure out ways to make it crystal clear and more, it's still permanent, but more permanent, then yes, I think we could end up with that. I think at the moment it's still a developing art form, so you may not end up seeing it in as high of respect yet, but I think in the future it absolutely could be. We put in colored contacts all the time, so why not?
Okay. Right, so let's just take the last question now. Let's take the question from Nick here, Nick Scott, and it also relates to the question that Ellie has asked, and also I think fits very nicely with what you've told us about the changing history of tattooing. Says, do you think that getting a tattoo or tattoos is a generational thing? It seems very popular in the UK at the moment. It's also, as it is popular in other places, parts in Europe, Spain, Italy, etc. So there's sort of waxing and waning thing. What's your view of where we are at the moment?
So right now, I think we're in so it's a complicated question, unfortunately. Not only do we have the waxing and waning because of things like socioeconomics and also because of trends towards conservatism, trends towards more liberal ideologies, but it's complicated because of who is allowed to wear a stigmatized thing and still function in society. And this is really where we talk about things like white privilege, for instance. Among young white people, absolutely, it's probably okay for you to go get a tattoo. However, there's still so much racial angst and racial stereotyping that happens that a person of color, a Black Indigenous person of color or person of Latinx, particularly in America, might face even more stigmatization because of the combination and the intersection of both race and having something that is still considered a little bit taboo. So my hope is that we can get it to a point where no one is stigmatized for having a tattoo, regardless of privilege, race, any of that. As for its current place, I say that it's definitely less stigmatized than it was in the early 2000s. However, we're also seeing waves of conservatism come back, and I mean social conservatism, not necessarily political. And so anytime that happens, we tend to see a revolt back to no, tattoos are bad, tattoos, sign of devil, and yes, there is some generational factors, but again, it's what time period you grew up in. I was in a grocery store not too long ago wearing a tank top because it's 106 degrees Fahrenheit. And I was just buying some groceries, and this little old couple walked by me, and the little old lady looks over at me and says, not in that, the whisper where you actually are intending people to hear you, leans over to her husband and goes, well, look at her. Her tattoos have ruined her life. She's not going to become anything. And I immediately turned around and said, well, it's such a shame. I'm an author of 3 books. I have a master's degree. I have a PhD. I'm a professor. I've so messed up my life. And immediately her husband started laughing and she ran away. But, so there are still these generational factors that can happen. So hopefully in the future, we can see the breakdown of the social structures that keep certain people stigmatized when they have tattoos, but also just the general destigmatization of tattoos continuing in the future.
Thank you very much. That's a very nice point to end. Thank you. It was a really tremendous talk, and you've been so generous answering a whole load of questions. And thank you to the audience for putting those questions in. Yeah. And
thank you all for being here. I really appreciate talking to all of you about this. Thank you for coming and listening to me verbally ramble about tattoos for a little bit. I'm always happy to answer questions if you'd like to email me. But thank you, Michael, for hosting this panel. And thank you to the York Festival of Ideas for allowing me to come and talk. This has been wonderful.
Brilliant. So just the final thing to say to everyone before we leave is that the recording of this event will be available on the festival YouTube channel, which can be accessed from the Watch Again section of the festival website after the 24th of June. So we hope you'll continue to be engaged with the Festival of Ideas. Check out the website for full details of all events. We'd love to hear your thoughts, continue the conversations, use the hashtag @YorkIdeas. So with that, thank you again, Alison, and we'll say good night.